So our story begins talking about this guy named William Mustard. Now, back in the time when we were in, performing surgery on the heart was almost completely restricted until World War II, when several soldiers had wounds to the chest. Several of the sharp metals or glass that got into their system cut into the heart. And after several successful attempts at this, these men were saved. And all around the country and perhaps even the world, doctors everywhere were going into people and attempting to save people with normal issues, not necessarily things that can happen during wartime. For example, VSD, or ventricular septal defect. In this case, William Mustard was trying to help children with VSD. And basically it's people who are born, and this is a diagram of the heart, in between the two ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle, there'd be a little hole right here. And in this hole, this would make the blood, the deoxygenated blood and the reoxygenated blood mix around. And this can cause trouble because you could either reoxygenate oxygenated blood, wasting time, or sending deoxygenated blood to the rest of the body, which again would be wasting the blood even traveling anywhere. So Dr. William Mustard, he was thinking about this, and some of the why most people were dying because they were attempting this is that they would operate on the heart too long, and they figured out that nothing was taking the old function of the heart. So what doctors were trying to think about is what could they do to keep blood flowing throughout the body at the same time as the blood getting oxygenated and getting pumped. So William Mustard thought about monkeys. And monkeys are very similar to humans, actually, if you think about it. They actually are pretty similar. And what he also thought, and was right, was that monkey lungs were very similar to human lungs. So what William Mustard proposed was that we were going to take the lungs from these monkeys, and while operating on a person, he would connect these lungs to the person's lungs so then that the person could breathe. And that how would it circulate? Well, it would circulate through the lungs, because the biggest problem here was reoxygenating and deoxygenating the blood. So while operating on this person, actually he first dealt with some little children, of course, but sadly there were some complications connecting the lungs to the person without actually killing them. So this caused the children to die. And the patient died on the table. Next, he tried again with a slightly older child, about 5 years old, I believe. And he didn't die on the table. He died 2 hours after the operation. And thinking about the success, Dr. Mustard proceeded to operate on more people to see if this would do any good. But sadly, the bodies just kept piling up, and there was really no hope for this technique. He would operate from children from 11 years old all the way to about 19 days. So after figuring out this wouldn't work, sadly well, a lot of people did encourage Dr. Mustard for what he did, unlike the two other people we learned about before. For example, Dr. Charles Bailey and Dr. Dwight Harkin. Remembering back in our story before, Charles Bailey trying to operate on people with holes in not working valves of the heart. Same thing with Dr. Harkin. And I think in total about 12 or 11, around that sort of number, people, that was how many people died before the first successful valve surgery of the heart. Later, our story takes place to someone else. This time, Dr. Wilfred Bigelow. Now, Dr. Bigelow, growing up in Toronto, noticed that during the winter, groundhogs, they would go inside during the very cold weather, they'd go deep inside the ground to stay warmer. Now, although they would stay warmer, they'd still be pretty cold. So, in order to get food, or when they would go to hibernation, they wouldn't need as much food, or they wouldn't need to move as much. So, thus there was less need for the heart or blood to the other organs and muscles of the body, and most importantly, the brain. And if you don't know this, the brain usually takes about 4 minutes without blood until it is decided as dead, on average. So, what Dr. Wilfred Bigelow proposed was that he would take his patient and essentially he would put the room in freezing temperature, of course with the anesthesia, until the person would eventually freeze and, well, they would get hyperthermia. And with this hyperthermia, the brain didn't need as much blood, and the heart did not need to work as hard as it needed to in order to operate on the heart. So, Dr. Bigelow first decided to operate on this 24-year-old over here, or 27-year-old, sorry, this 27-year-old, and while he was operating, it did seem like a good success, and it actually did not take that long. He did it in a whopping 6 minutes. Now, this might not seem very much, but usually the limit is 4, and this is not including sewing the person back up. And this seemed like, at first, a huge success. But what Dr. Bigelow did not see was that as soon as he was done, the patient, he could not reciprocate his patient, and she was dying in front of his eyes. Now, what happened that he didn't see before was that because it was freezing, he forgot that he left some air bubbles in the heart, and this was one of the problems that he was trying to overcome, not leaving any air bubbles through the freezing patient, and thus the bubbles slowly ripped the heart, and, well, the patient died. Now, later, we go to this other patient, this other doctor, named Dr. John Lewis, and he sought Dr. Bigelow's ideas, and he also was about a decade younger than Harkin or Bailey. Now, obviously it doesn't look like this, but I could not find a good picture of John Lewis, the cardiologist, because there are so many. So I took one around that time. I think his name was Thomas Lewis. But anyway, that aside, Dr. Lewis would soon find his eyes on this 5-year-old girl who lived with carnival performers who had not VSD, ventricular septal defect, but instead of VSD, she actually had ASD. Now this might not be as bad, but just like VSD, usually this would cause children not be able to live to adulthood. So, in the heart, instead of a hole in between the two ventricles, there was a hole in between the two atriums, between the right atrium and the left atrium. And this would cause very similar problems, although not as much, because ventricles are a lot more powerful than atriums. And the ventricles are actually the real pumps of the heart, especially the left ventricle. So this is not as bad, but still, like I said, still causes the person to freeze. So, operating what Dr. Lewis and his assistant, Dr. Walton Lillehei, who actually himself had cancer, which did slowly slow down his career, but we'll talk about that next video because this one is actually a little bit long. They would do exactly what Dr. Bigelow did, but instead, without the resources that they did, they would also be working in the same temperature, not as much. And they would also try to work against the clock. And they were actually, again, they were also what seemed to be very successful. This time in a whopping 5.5 minutes. So just 30 seconds less than Dr. Bigelow did. And in the farm that they were in, because that's all they had at the moment, they just dunked their patient into a hot bath, and slowly their little 5-year-old child woke up and was alive and actually didn't die. And this was to be the first open heart surgery.